that it's something that came up absolutely as a surprise. And from what I understand, for example, the crew did not even report any problems.
Now, let me ask you this because it's something that possibly could come up. There was a lot of security because there was the first Israeli ever aboard the shuttle to take part as a crew member in that flight. We're getting word now that from the White House saying that there's no way that terror was involved. But for people that may have questions about whether or not it would be possible to shoot down a shuttle, speak to that.
Well, I'm not an expert in anti-aircraft missiles and armaments and that sort of thing, but I believe that you would have to have a missile that would fly up to an altitude in excess of 200,000 feet, which is what I understand the shuttle was at when it came apart. And as to the best of my knowledge, there are not such anti-aircraft rockets or missiles available. That falls into the category of the Star Wars stuff that the government is trying to develop now at that altitude.
And we were talking 200,000 feet in the air. John Getter, former NASA reporter, thank you so much for some of your insight.
For those of you just now waking up or perhaps trying to read the morning newspaper and flipping on the television set, let me tell you what has happened. It has been a devastating moment here in American history and the space program, and especially for NASA, if what we have been reporting appears to come true. And that is that the Space Shuttle Columbia, as it had re-entered the Earth's atmosphere and was hovering, gliding, if you will, over northwest Texas, suddenly, apparently, and these are the pictures, began to break up. There has been no communication with Columbia and its 7 astronauts on board since 9 a.m. Eastern Time, 8 Central. That is 1 hour and 31 minutes ago. It appears as though all has been lost. Tony Snow joins us now on the telephone. And Tony, you have a great many contacts in Washington, D.C. What is the sense there?
Actually, Greg, I can join you straight from studio. The sense here, obviously, is what you've been reporting, which is the shuttle is lost. The president was informed about the disaster earlier today by Andy Card, the White House chief of staff, and at that point, plans were made for the president to return from Camp David to the White House. People are scrambling at the Pentagon. They're scrambling at NASA. They are scrambling throughout the government to try to figure out what's gone on. This is kind of one of the grim ironies of this is that this shuttle mission was the 28th flight of the Shuttle Columbia and the 113th shuttle mission altogether. It focused on astronaut safety and health, advanced technology development. Those were 2 of the 3 major research areas, which now seems a grisly irony. The other thing is, Bill Nelson pointed out earlier, the senator from Florida, who flew on the 24th shuttle mission, which also took place aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia, which blew up today, that on the 27th of January, 1967, 3 astronauts died on the pad at Cape Kennedy. This was Virgil Grissom, Roger Chaffee, and Bill White. Then in 1987, the 28th of January, just one day after the anniversary, if you want to put it that way, of the deaths on Apollo 1, suddenly you had the Space Shuttle Challenger. And now, 16 years almost to the day after that tragedy, we have the explosion aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia. Nobody at this point has any more details. Everybody's scrambling to come up with anything to say. An international mission, the White House has ruled out the possibility of terrorism, as somebody pointed out. You'd have to have a missile capable of hitting at 38 miles, and there are only a handful of countries that have that. That's not something you can do from a shoulder-launched rocket. So this appears to be a catastrophic technological failure. And now, after the Space Shuttle Challenger went down, after the Challenger accident, there were a long series of hearings on Capitol Hill with recriminations and so on. You may recall there was a debate about O-rings. It turned out that there was the failure to seal near one of the engines, an O-ring produced by Morton Thiokol. That produced a long series of investigations and about a 2-year shutdown in the shuttle mission. Now, this year, NASA had planned on putting together a very ambitious series of flights in support of the International Space Station. My guess is that those will also be put on hold indefinitely, pending the investigation into what went on today.
Tony Snow, if you would stand by for just a moment, a few more questions for you.
And we have with us on the phone Luke Ward. He is the mayor of Fairfield, Texas. The shuttle was going over the area in Texas when it apparently disintegrated into flames. A lot of witnesses there report hearing a big bang about 9 o'clock a.m., right around the same time when radio and data communication with the shuttle was lost as NASA was trying to communicate. And Luke Ward, mayor of Fairfield, Texas, was a witness as well. Are you on the phone? Can you hear us?
Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. I sure can.
Thanks for being with us. Tell us what you heard and what you saw, if anything.
Contingency plans designed to secure all information and data pertinent to today's descent by the Space Shuttle Columbia. Communications with the Space Shuttle Columbia were lost at approximately 8 a.m. Central Time this morning at an altitude of about 200,000 feet above north central Texas, as Columbia was en route to a landing planned at 8:16 a.m. Central Time at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. At the time communication was lost, Columbia was traveling approximately 12,500 miles per hour.
You've been listening
Search and rescue teams in
to
the
NASA.
Dallas-Fort
We continue
Worth
to listen.
vicinity and in portions of East Texas and other pertinent areas have been alerted to the Space Shuttle contingency. Any debris that may be related to the Space Shuttle contingency that is located should be avoided and may be hazardous due to the toxic nature of propellants that are used on board the Space Shuttle. Any locations of debris should be immediately reported to local law enforcement agencies. This is Mission Control, Houston.
We have periodically, and we will do so, anytime Mission Control speaks, we will take it live and interrupt whatever we are doing. But when we first heard, roughly 45 minutes, almost an hour ago, that they were warning the residents of Texas to beware of debris, it was that word that appeared to be an implicit admission that the shuttle Columbia and its 7 crew members had been lost. And then, of course, came in the video that we have been watching so much of this morning, captured on videotape, of what appears to be Columbia breaking up in midair at 12,500 miles per hour, in excess of 200 feet over north central Texas.
And as one of our guests that we were speaking with pointed out, eerily similar to the Challenger when we saw that go down in 1986. That was on takeoff. Joining us, Luke Ward. He's the mayor of Fairfield, Texas, and he witnessed some of what we've been showing you here. Are you still on the phone with us?
Yes, ma'am, I sure am.
Thanks for being here. Tell us a little bit about what you saw and what you heard as this shuttle went overhead.
Well, actually, I was sitting on the phone conversation with my neighbor, and just as I hung up, I heard it sound like, you know, somebody trying to kick the back door in. First thing I did is run to the front door to look out to see, you know, if I could see an explosion, because it was actually that loud, and then it actually continued to rumble for a good 1 or 2 minutes, like it was kind of like a truck with a flat tire, but just much intense. So I got a couple neighbors call and said, you know, had I heard it? And I said, yeah, we were just basically trying to figure it out. So I sat back and looked at the news, and no sooner than that, they said they lost contact with the shuttle. So then I began to say, could that possibly be the connection? And at that point, then they did say it was over north central Texas. So actually what we had heard was more than likely something from that.
Did you see any of this?
No, ma'am, I didn't. I never could. I looked out all directions. Matter of fact, I saw a contrail from what looked to be an airplane, but I never did see even any residual contrails or anything. So actually, I don't know if it was for whatever reason, we didn't see any trails or anything.
Right, and I'm sure you are aware that NASA now asking people, especially in your neck of the woods, to be careful for debris that could be dangerous, possibly toxic. Are you talking to your townspeople about this type of situation?
Our next goal is just to inform people not to touch it, and if they find something, of course, to report it to local authorities, and of course they'll take it from there. That'd be the main thing to do, just to inform the citizens in the local areas if they see something that looks strange, don't mess with it.
All right, so I imagine just a really frightening and disturbing situation there as what we're looking at, this shuttle Columbia disaster. Looks like it was breaking apart right over that part of Texas.
Yes, ma'am.
Luke Ward, mayor of Fairfield, Texas, thanks for being with us on the phone.
As we continue to follow the shuttle Columbia disaster, if we can, let me ask the control room to put up the collective picture of the crew. 7 astronauts on board, including an Israeli astronaut for the very first time. And here they are, Shuttle Commander Rick Husband, who had logged about 235 hours and 13 minutes in space. The shuttle pilot William McCool, who has over 2,800 hours of flight experience in 24 aircraft. Shuttle mission specialist Kaplana Chawla, who has a PhD, by the way, born in India, holds a PhD in aerospace engineering. And then also aboard this shuttle mission, Specialist David Brown, who's logged more than 2,700 flight hours in 1,700 high-performance military aircraft. He is qualified, by the way, as first pilot in the NASA T-38. Let's listen into NASA.
Communications were lost with the Space Shuttle Columbia at approximately 8 a.m. Central Time as it flew at an altitude of 200,000 feet and a speed of approximately 12,500 miles per hour toward a planned landing at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Touchdown for Columbia was scheduled for 8:16 a.m. Central Time in Florida. Search and rescue teams in the Dallas-Fort Worth vicinity in portions of East Texas and other pertinent areas have been alerted to the Space Shuttle contingency. Any debris that may be located that may be related to the Space Shuttle's contingency should be avoided and may be hazardous due to the toxic nature of propellants used on board the Space Shuttle. Its location should be immediately reported to local law enforcement agencies. Further information will be released as it becomes available. This is Mission Control, Houston.
We will periodically be taking any word that we get from Mission Control in Houston. They've been periodically coming on and giving that warning that if anyone were to encounter debris, to stay away from it as it could be toxic. And if you are just joining us, we are covering the Shuttle Columbia disaster. There's still no official word from NASA on what might have happened as that shuttle had completed a successful mission and was heading back in to Earth for a landing. And there you see, and as we can see from the pictures, it appears that the shuttle disintegrated as it was coming in. You see pieces of debris and then several different trails of smoke instead of just one, indicating that there is a breakup of the object moving through the air. The shuttle had been missing, lost radio contact about 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time with Mission Control. It was due to come in for a landing in Florida at 9:15. And we are getting word as well from people that raised the question, especially as to whether or not the shuttle could have been a terror target, because there was an Israeli on board, the first Israeli ever to be in space in a shuttle, and senior White House officials saying that there was no reason to believe that there was any threat made against the flight or the shuttle, and that at an altitude of 207,000 feet over north central Texas, which is where the shuttle was when it lost contact, it would be out of range of surface-to-air missiles. Our Tony Snow in Washington has also been following the latest developments in this tragedy. He joins us as well. And President Bush canceling his weekend retreat at Camp David, coming back to what looks like a national tragedy.
Well, absolutely, Karen. And obviously, everybody has to assess what happened. The bizarre thing is that we've seen these pictures of trails through the sky, but nobody, at least to our knowledge yet, has recovered even a single piece of debris. Everybody now is trying to make sense of what seems senseless. The other interesting, I guess, bit of speculation will be they seem to have successfully re-entered the atmosphere. That happens at about 400,000 feet. Halfway home, there appears to have been an explosion that people said sounded like a car blowing up out on the street, at least according to one wire report. So it shook windows in Texas. So we're going to spend a lot of time trying to figure out what that is all about. But once you get past the technical aspects, the president does sort of what Ronald Reagan did after the Challenger accident. You may recall there was a teacher on board. Her name was Krista McAuliffe. This was one of the attempts by NASA back in the late 1980s to say, you know what, space flight is something that's available to all. In fact, there was a call for journalists and politicians and others to join the ride. That was a sobering experience. And since then, we've had no such efforts by NASA to bring on so-called civilians, although the Russians have been taking out some people who will pay to get on. Well, this time, we have for the first time an Israeli aboard, an Israeli pilot. It's one of those things that draws a lot of public attention. NASA had invited me and a number of others to come down and see it. Unfortunately, I was unable to go see the launch, unfortunately, because I'm told they're spectacular things. So the president now faces the challenge of saying something. Now, after the Challenger accident, you may recall that the President Reagan gave a wonderful, heartfelt speech that actually drew from an old prayer that TV stations used to read at the end of the night when TV stations actually went off the air at about midnight or 1 a.m. And it talked about slipping the surly bonds of earth and touching the hand of God. Well, This is one of those times where a president will reach for eloquence, but George W. Bush is somebody who tries not to overreach. We have seen that he is strongest when he speaks in simple, declarative, and heartfelt terms. It may be that the White House simply will issue a written statement. Who knows? But at a time like this, all of us are in complete awe. We have no idea what goes on. A lot of us, of course, think of space flight as something wonderful and exotic and something that's in the province of people who are a lot smarter than we are. In this particular mission, this was one where they actually bid for the experiments that would be conducted. It's become such a competitive business that if you want something done, you've got to put forward a proposal to NASA, and only the best ones win. And as I pointed out earlier, one of the things they were studying on this was astronaut safety and health. It's a grim irony, and one certainly hopes that at least they got some data that may be useful. But on the technical side, until we know what happened today, we're certainly not going to know how to fix it. As I mentioned earlier, this almost certainly is going to lead to a suspension of all NASA flights for the time being, and I would be stunned if we didn't hear something from NASA sometime today. And obviously, if that should happen, we'll bring it to you on Fox News Channel. But here in Washington, like everywhere else, we see the pictures, we try to take stock. You have a certain prayerful awe because this is something too terrible to comprehend, and yet the pictures aren't going to lie. Today, a lot of astronauts died.
Tony Snow, thank you very much. We want to show you once again, if we may. There is the crew, all 7 of them, including for the very first time an Israeli astronaut, the shuttle commander Rick Husband, shuttle pilot William McCool, shuttle mission specialist Kaplana Chawla, born in India, shuttle mission specialist David Brown, shuttle mission specialist Michael P. Anderson, shuttle mission specialist Laurel Blair Salton Clark, who, by the way, is a doctor. She has an MD degree. Shuttle payload specialist Ilan Ramon, who is a colonel in the Israeli Air Force, who has accumulated more than 3,000 flight hours, a hero among Israelis. And there are the 7 crew members who are believed to be lost, though we are not receiving any official word from NASA as yet. But based upon their own admission that they are searching for a debris field and warning residents of Texas to beware of it, but also the fact that we have seen these pictures which seem to indicate that the space shuttle itself at some point after re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere, and then as it was about 200,000 feet above Earth, traveling at 12,500 miles per hour, seemed to break up, according to the pictures. And again, once, as we've been saying before, so reminiscent of that fateful day, January 28, 1986, when we saw something similar, not upon the landing process, but rather the takeoff of the Space Shuttle Challenger when it exploded shortly after takeoff.
What we are seeing is an amateur video shot by just a bystander out of Dallas, Texas. And there you can see, this is new, and you can see a little bit more clearly 3 different trails of smoke and debris coming down. The trees obscuring it a little bit, but we also had some video from some of the affiliates there in Dallas, Texas, showing that definitely something wasn't right.
It bears repeating that we have talked to a couple of experts, one of them a former astronaut this morning. At that rate of speed, again, in excess of 12,000 miles per hour, it would be nearly impossible for a human being unprotected with just a space suit to have survived the friction of that rate of speed, and moreover, likely wouldn't be able to survive at that altitude for very long. Again, roughly 207,000 feet over north central Texas.
And it is important to note, as Tony Snow was alluding to as well earlier when we heard from him, that we take it for granted. This is such a difficult thing to do, to launch a space shuttle and to safely bring it back to Earth. The slightest nuance can really make the difference. If you come in at an angle just slightly different than how you're supposed to, this can burn up. And in 42 years of U.S. manned space flight, there has never been an accident happening during the descent to Earth or landing. As we know, in 1986, as you just said, Greg, the Space Shuttle Challenger exploding shortly after liftoff. We do have someone on the phone with us, Congressman Joe Barton. He's on the committee that oversees NASA. He represents the district where this shuttle apparently disintegrated. Thanks for being with us, Congressman.
Oh, well, I'm not happy to be with you on this occasion, but I'm pleased to talk to you some.
And as I was just saying, you oversee NASA. Explain just how difficult and how much maneuvering and how much goes into making these things happen and making sure that this happens safely, and how tough it can be to get these things on the ground safely.
Well, the space shuttle, first of all, is technology that's approximately 20 to 30 years old. It's basically a big glider. When it comes back in from space, the computers control it until it almost is ready to land, and it's on a very narrow glide path, and the tiles are designed so that it absorbs the heat and keeps the craft from burning up. And we don't know what happened. We do think that it fell somewhere over north central Texas, probably in my congressional district.
8 a.m. Central Time, as Columbia was above north central Texas at an altitude of 200,000 feet, traveling approximately 12,500 miles per hour. Search and rescue forces in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and in other portions along Columbia's planned route have been alerted to the Space Shuttle program contingency. Any debris that may be found that may be related to the Space Shuttle contingency should be immediately reported to local authorities and avoided. Debris may be hazardous due to the toxic nature of propellants used on board the Space Shuttle. Further information will be released as it becomes available. This is Mission Control, Houston.
And again, Congressman, we had to interrupt you. Periodically, NASA's Mission Control comes on and gives a little bit of a warning about staying away from the debris field, which I'm sure your own constituents need to know. And so we were interrupted. So if you could continue, as you were telling us before, this situation looks like the debris field is going to be in your own district, and you are...
well, we've already got search helicopters around my hometown in the county that I live in, Ellis County, which is just southeast of Dallas-Fort Worth. My senior staffer heard the boom at her home. I'm actually in Waco, Texas, so I was not there when it happened. What I had said that I hope I could repeat, this is a tragic accident, but it is very important for the United States and the world that we be in space. I'm on the subcommittee that oversees NASA. We'll have a complete investigation. I've already touched base with the White House and NASA, offered my services and the congressional services. I hope that once we find out what happened, if we can find out what happened, that we can take corrective measures on the existing shuttle craft that we still have, keep the current program going, and perhaps build a new shuttle with new technology that might make things like this even less likely to happen in the future.
Congressman, we know that the shuttle Columbia is the oldest of the shuttles that fly these missions. Any concerns about whether or not that might have played a part?
Well, the shuttle fleet, each shuttle has got a life expectancy and a number of flights that it's guaranteed for, and the Columbia was well within its life expectancy. In other words, the airframe was safe and had been inspected to be secure and trustworthy. So, again, without knowing what happened, I'm not going to speculate, but I guarantee you the NASA people would not have put that shuttle up if they had thought that there was a structural problem, that it couldn't withstand the reentry. Something unforeseen happened. It hit something, or the computer software went wrong, or there's been some speculation about terrorism. I don't think that's
and Congressman,
probability. So
let me have you pause there for a moment on that very subject. We want to reiterate what we reported earlier, that a senior U.S. official is saying there was no threat made against the flight and that the shuttle was out of range of a surface-to-air missile when it lost contact with NASA. There are 6 Americans and an Israeli on board, the latter of which prompted tighter than usual security when Columbia was launched on January 16th. So we do want to emphasize that point. Also want to report that the Homeland Security Department is saying that there is no information at this time that this was a terrorist incident. They are reiterating what the White House is also saying.
And if you are on the phone still with us, Congressman, you said you did touch base with the White House today. What was said?
That they were establishing contact with NASA and that they were right on top of it, and they were going to make sure that there was a full investigation. And they were also trying to contact the chairman of the Full Science Committee, Sherwood Bollard of New York, and the ranking Democrat, Ralph Hall of Texas. And I was the first I was the first congressman to contact them because it's in my district, and I just offered my services, and on behalf of the committee, that I'm sure that the chairman and the ranking Democrat would work very cooperatively with the White House and NASA.
Congressman, thank you very much for taking a few minutes out of your busy schedule to talk with us. We appreciate it. The Space Shuttle Challenger has apparently disintegrated in flames over Texas minutes before it was to land. And some of the debris has, Columbia, I apologize. The Space Shuttle Columbia has disintegrated in flames. Let's go to Keith Landry of our Fox affiliate, who's standing by at Cape Kennedy. Keith, what can you tell us? Were you with some of the family members?
No, the family members were in a VIP delegation. We were out at the area where the media assembles to cover the landing of the Space Shuttle Columbia. They are off in a separate delegation. They were taken away. We have not seen them. We have not spoken to them. They are not in a location where the media can talk to them. The latest here right now, we are in a holding pattern. We are waiting for the officials of NASA here at Kennedy Space Center to convene a news conference to tell us what's going on. They are still assessing information. Most of the information is coming out of Houston this morning. We can tell you that Space Shuttle Columbia was supposed to end a 16-day mission. This was mission number 107, and it was supposed to touch down on runway 33 here at Kennedy Space Center at 9:16 Eastern Standard Time. But at 9 o'clock Eastern Time, 8 o'clock Central Time, Houston lost contact with the Space Shuttle Columbia and has not heard anything from it since then. Now, the mood on the ground at that time, there are a lot of people who've been out here for many, many years watching the landings, watching the launches. They know exactly how it works and how it goes, what their standard procedures are. At about 3 minutes before it was scheduled to land, we were supposed to hear double sonic booms. And when that didn't happen, people started to wonder what was going on. And when the launch clock on the ground at the landing area got down to 0 and then kept going in the other direction, then we knew something was wrong. There were monitors set up here at the landing area that were supposed to show the media the descent of the shuttle, and those went to black. So it became very obvious very quickly that something was wrong here. Inside the building in front of me, the folks have very somber looks on their faces right now. The entire NASA staff, they really don't have a whole lot of information. Most of it is coming out of Houston. The obvious question here is what happens to the future of NASA's space shuttle program. Shuttle Atlantis was scheduled to go up March 1st, carrying some more parts for the International Space Station. That mission is in doubt right now, as NASA will have to regroup and assess what happened. 2 points of early speculation, and that's exactly what it is at this point. 2 points. A, when the shuttle launched 16 days ago, there was some foam that came off of one of the external rocket boosters and hit the left wing, damaging some of the tiles. There's speculation that the damage from that could have been considerable enough that on re-entry it somehow caused the shuttle to break up in midair. Engineers had looked at the left wing of the shuttle once it was in space, and they thought that it seemed to be okay. The second point for early speculation on the possible cause of this dates back to last year, July of 2002, when the shuttle originally was supposed to go up. The mission was delayed until this year because of a leak in some of the oxygen lines. Too early to say what role that may have played. It's going to take weeks or months to figure out what actually happened. But 7 astronauts, 6 Americans, 1 Israeli. The first Israeli in space, Ilan Ramon, apparently perishing today in very tragic fashion. Rescue crews, search and rescue crews are on the ground in central Texas. They've been dispatched to try to see if there's anything that they can do. I did ask some folks here at NASA, at Kennedy Space Center, after the Challenger disaster back in 1986, there was a lot of talk about putting an ejection mechanism into the cabin crew so that maybe it would buy them some kind of a chance to get out. Realistically speaking, it wouldn't do much good. It wouldn't do much good because of the 17,000 miles an hour that the shuttle is traveling when it re-enters the Earth's atmosphere. It comes down at about 12,000 miles an hour in its mid-descent. So if something happens, there's not much that they can do. We are waiting for a news conference from NASA. That'll be the latest from Kennedy Space Center. Let's go back to you now.
All right, Keith Landry there with us, and of course we will be on standby for us, like you said, about 30 minutes from now. NASA's scheduled to hold a press conference. And Greg, when we heard this news, it was the same collective feeling, even in the newsroom, that pit in your stomach, the sinking feeling, and just the weakness in your knees as you think to yourself, I hope this is going to be good news. You're seeing that NASA says we have a little bit of a problem here. We've lost contact.
Right.
And then as soon as we saw the pictures of the video, it really was heartbreaking to see.
We were all expecting any minute now to hear from NASA. Oh, we found them. We've reestablished contact. That did, of course, not happen. And now it appears as though the shuttle Columbia has disintegrated. We've seen videotape of it. There will be a news conference in 1/2 hour by NASA. And apparently, this bulletin just crossed a short time ago from Reuters News Service that NASA says shuttle debris has been sighted in north central Texas.
On the phone with us, Ed Campion, NASA spokesperson. Thanks for being with us. I know it's an extremely busy and sad time there at NASA. We're hearing word now that a debris field was sighted in north central Texas. Can you tell us any more about that?
I can't tell you any more about that. All I can tell you is that the team in Mission Control is working with the search and rescue organizations in the Texas area to try and understand what's happening in terms of debris that's coming down.
There's no official word yet from NASA that the shuttle indeed was lost or burnt up in air. Are we going to be expected to hear that at 11:30?
We're going to provide information as soon as we can, but we want to make sure we have confirmation before we give out any facts. All we know right now for sure is that we did lose communication with the shuttle at approximately 9 a.m. Eastern Time as it was making its way towards Kennedy Space Center. It was scheduled to land at about 9:16 a.m. Communication and tracking of the shuttle was lost at an altitude of just over 200,000 feet in the area over north central Texas. And at the time we lost communications, the shuttle was traveling at approximately 12,500 miles an hour. That's about Mach 18.
What did NASA do at that point after the communication was lost? Walk us through, if you will, a little bit of what you do in these horrid circumstances.
Well, when we first lost communications, there are set procedures both for the team on the ground as well as the crew on board the shuttle that if they lose communications, they know what they need to do. They have cue cards that they look at to continue flying the vehicle. At the same time, folks on the ground start checking to see why they're not seeing any data. They start working troubleshooting procedures. When it became obvious that we had a serious problem, the flight controllers started securing data, preserving all the data in their system so that we can analyze it closer.
I understand when the contact was lost, family members that were waiting there for the arrival were herded away and taken. What's going on with them right now?
Well, we always have astronaut escorts with each of the family members, and they're being taken care of.
I might add here, if I can for a moment, we're just getting word that NASA has lowered the flag next to its countdown clock to half-staff. That is obviously a symbolic confirmation of what we have been fearing all morning long, and that is that all 7 of the astronauts on board, including the first Israeli astronaut, have been lost when the Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated as it was over Texas on its landing approach to Cape Kennedy. And we have seen, of course, now there's the crew, all 7 members of them. And we have seen the videotape, which seems to bear out those fears that the shuttle had broken up at a terrific speed and in flames. A debris field has now been found on the ground in Texas. Karen?
Something made this flight a little bit different, a lot of publicity around the fact that an Israeli pilot was going to be the first Israeli to be in space and to be on this shuttle mission. Word just coming in now from Prime Minister of Israel, Ariel Sharon's office, a statement saying the government of Israel and the people of Israel praying together with the entire world for the safety of the astronauts on the shuttle Columbia. Also saying the state of Israel and its citizens are one at this very difficult time. The man, Ilan Ramon, was, according to Sharon, quote, fulfilling everyone's dream to be the first Israeli in space. And again, 6 other American astronauts also on the shuttle Columbia. We are continuing our coverage of the shuttle Columbia disaster now. I'm Kieran Chetri here in New York, along with Greg Jarrett. We're going to turn the coverage over to our Shepard Smith.
11:05 now in the east, 8:05 in the west, and this is Fox News continuing coverage of what is clearly a national tragedy. The shuttle has exploded and rained over Texas, and one of the people watching it was Benjamin Laster. He's in the town of Kemp, Texas, and joins us now on the phone. Mr. Laster, thank you for joining us. What did you see?
Yes, I'd say approximately probably around 8:03, 8:04, something like that. My wife and I went outside to observe the space shuttle landing, and we seen the space shuttle coming across, and we seen it was very clear outside. It was very, very clear, like it is now. And we seen the shuttle coming across, and as we seen it coming across, the shuttle started breaking up. And we thought at first that it was just the panels coming off. And my wife had told me, she said, something's wrong. Something's coming off the panels. She said something was coming off of it. And I said, well, that's probably just the solar panels. They have to do that to protect it to enter in the atmosphere. And so then we seen it coming across, and we went in the front yard, and we looked up, and then we seen a lot of big pieces of debris coming across. And we also seen an aircraft in the vicinity. So as it was coming across, it was going in a downward position, angle. And as we seen it coming across, it passed over us, and we heard a boom. And prior military experience being on aircraft carriers, I've seen flybys and I've seen booms before, and that was like I didn't know whether it was a sonic boom or not, but it shook the house, and it was like a deep roaring impact. And after we seen that, we seen a lot of more pieces breaking off of it, and it just disintegrated.
Benjamin Laster is an eyewitness from Kemp, Texas, who got up this morning to watch the shuttle fly across and instead saw the shuttle break up. NASA now officially reports debris has been sighted in north central Texas. The flags are now at half-staff at NASA at Cape Canaveral in Florida. Our broadcast stations up and down the line across the nation will be returning to local programming. However, stay tuned for continuing coverage on Fox News Channel on cable. I'm Shepard Smith in New York. Continuing coverage now on Fox News Channel of the disaster and the crash of the space shuttle. Let's go back now to Benjamin Laster on the phone in Kemp, Texas. Mr. Laster, had you gotten up this morning specifically to watch the shuttle?
Yes, sir, I did. My wife had informed us that the shuttle was going to come over, and she went outside and she said, come on. So everybody in the house, basically my mom, my dad, and my daughter, we went outside to see it, and we seen a very bright object. We could see the shuttle.
Mr. Laster, I apologize for interrupting you, but I need to get over to a NASA official who's on the line with us now. Eileen Holly is on the line, I believe joining us from Mission Control in Houston. Ms. Holly, thank you for being with us. What can you tell us?
Well, I probably can't tell you too much more than you already know. We did lose communication with the orbiter at 8 o'clock Central Time this morning, expecting a landing in Florida about 16 minutes later. There is evidence that the shuttle may have disintegrated as it flew overhead Dallas. That was, they would have been at about 200,000 feet at that time and traveling Mach 18, which is better than 12,000 miles per hour, and we've not received any additional data since that time.
Initial concerns, especially in the world in which we live now, send a lot of minds in one direction. Can you offer any assurance that at that level it would be impossible for anyone to cause sabotage against that shuttle?
Well, it's far too early to speculate on any of that. There's no evidence at this time that this was anything other than an accident.
Ms. Holly, thank you very much. Warren Ellie is on the line with us now. Warren Ellie of Fox station WTVT, Fox 13 in Tampa, who's been covering space shuttles for much more than a decade. Warren, what do you know?
Well, basically, Shep, at this point, it's a matter of trying to hold back in terms of speculation because, of course, as we just heard, there's no real way to know now. So many things enter your mind. The fact that Columbia had just been rehabbed, a year-long rehab, all new instrumentation, little bits and pieces of all these problems leading up to this liftoff that all cleared up. They didn't find any problems aboard this shuttle, but certainly nothing that would impact a landing operation. These were things, the cracks in fuel lines, problems about bearings in these big fuel lines. These were things related to liftoff towards ascent. So, Shep, it's very difficult at this point to tell. No question, at that altitude, 200,000 feet at that speed, 12,000 miles an hour, it would seem as though speculation about sabotage would be a long shot. But again, remember, when Challenger exploded, there was all kinds of speculation about what happened there, and as it turned out, it wasn't, of course, the explosion that blew up Challenger. It was the dynamics, the flight dynamics, just tearing the machine apart in that explosion.
Warren, is that what's been described to me as the zipper effect?
That's right. That's right. One little thing can happen, and it tears through the whole. That a point of pressure and dynamics, just like a can being opened up, torn open, that kind of thing.
To your knowledge, had there been a single problem with this mission?
None. There was a piece of insulation on liftoff that dislodged. It was described, Shepard, as a minor item. I've heard some speculation this morning about could that insulation have damaged the leading edge of a wing, perhaps, these kinds of things. But that kind of nick, I mean, these machines come back. I've seen dozens and dozens come back, and they'll have all kinds of nicks and scars and things of that nature, Shepard, that would not cause this kind of catastrophe.
Warren, I know that speculation runs rampant, and I want to stay away from it, but you're a man who's very close with the NASA community. Warren, how long have you been covering NASA now for?
Well, about 18 years, Shepard.
18 years, and it is a family at Kennedy Space Center, and I just wondered if you could give us an idea about how something like this affects that community.
Well, I got up this morning here in Tampa at just before 9 o'clock Eastern Time, turned on the television, knew there was going to be a landing. About 6 minutes after 9, I began to get that horrible feeling in my gut, and I called Kennedy Space Center. There was a woman there all by herself who was answering the phone, and you could tell just by the sound of her voice that it had happened again. It was just horrible. And knowing these people as well as I do, I can just imagine what they're going through. Many of them, of course, are worrying about what's next. Beyond the question of this horrible tragedy, there are 3 astronauts, 2 Americans and a Russian, aboard the International Space Station in orbit as we speak. March the 1st, another shuttle is scheduled, or was scheduled, to go up and bring that crew down and bring up a relief crew. What will happen now? They do, Shepard, have a Soyuz, a Russian capsule, as a standard operating procedure, is docked to the shuttle. There's 3 seats. The couches are custom made for these 3 space travelers, and they do have a means of coming home without a shuttle. But a big question, of course, is can the space station operate on its own remotely? Certainly, that's a question I don't think we know the answer to right now. I kind of doubt it, Shepard. So there's a big resource up there they're going to have to deal with.
Warren, refresh my memory as to how long it was that the space shuttle program was shut down after Challenger.
You know, I've been searching about, I believe it was 2 years. I think it was 2 years because you had a presidential commission, Shepard, that investigated after that many months of painstaking search and debris and all of that. And of course, all of us can see in our minds those chilling pictures of that tail section of the Challenger coming out of the Atlantic with that American flag and then being lowered into that missile silo where all those parts have been stored. This is going to be very tough. It's going to take a very long time to put together, certainly.
And the pictures that we will no doubt be seeing sometime in the hours ahead are of wreckage in North Texas. At the same time, Warren, if a shuttle cannot go back up because it's deemed unsafe or unknown at this time to get those people from the International Space Station, then what?
They would undoubtedly have to make a decision. How long could they stay? And if the decision is to abandon the station, which is a pretty big stretch in my mind at this point, they do have the Soyuz capsule, the Russian capsule. They would be able, of course, to return to Earth and until they could get some more people up there. But a question in my mind is just how long could that station operate remotely? You know, one of the big issues about this space station has been the staffing, Shepard. It takes, as near as experience has taught us so far, 3 astronauts to run the station. There's been a good deal of controversy about science aboard the station and the need for more crew members. The administration, the previous administration, had put the brakes on a large enough vehicle to carry 6 or 7 members back in case of an emergency, so this crew has been limited. There's been some discussion of adding another escape capsule, but the bottom line is, Shepard, this puts the space station, of course, very much a question of what, as you point out, what will happen next now.
I'm guessing at some point during the day, most likely after the president speaks, or if he chooses to do so, which I'm quite sure he will, that there will be some sort of event at NASA where they tell the American people and the world what they can. Do you have any indication of if and when that might happen?
Well, all we know, as you've been reporting, is that the anticipation is some kind of news conference at 11:30. We're not, I've understood perhaps the president, not been confirmed to me, but I know that NASA is struggling to put together what they can. I think what we're going to hear is more of, please give us a chance to analyze everything. These machines are so wired, they have a progression of telemetry right up to that last instant, and they have just tons and tons of data to analyze. So I don't think they're going to have anything concrete this soon. I think they are, like us, seeing these pictures, realizing that this spacecraft, just moments before it would become an aircraft, still under computer control, minutes away from human hands controlling this spacecraft for landing, disintegrated literally over a major American city. And I think that at this point they're going to try and put the brakes on any suggestions. Among the little bits and pieces, that leading edge insulation question. Also, we heard about pressure that built up very high in one of the landing gear tires. This just little bits and pieces from those sensors. That's how wired it is. And of course, Shepard, another thing that I keep thinking of is this is the 88th flight since the Challenger disaster, 88 times, and I cannot get out of my head the fact that we've heard over and over again that 100 is a magic number, that the odds are such that after 100 flights, the disaster is lurking around the corner, and everyone, of course, had dismissed that as they focus so heavily on safety. There's no doubt NASA has pumped the safety up. It's been very apparent over there.
We're seeing it is my understanding that the picture you now see on your screen is from North Texas, and the first bit of evidence on the ground of what happened in the sky. It's my understanding that this is a piece of Space Shuttle Columbia. Warren, as we move forward here, series of news conferences, there'll be a lot of politics involved. How do you see these first few days? I remember as a college sophomore learning about the significance of throttle up. Is there a significant point about that last moment of re-entry that is especially dangerous or more taxing on the vehicle that you know of?
Well, there's no question that, like the ascent, the landing has its stressors, those extreme stressors. And this point at which the shuttle loses communications with the ground, there's a reason why they lose communication. That is the point of the highest stress on the vehicle, of the most heat, the most dynamic action is the atmosphere. This shuttle is literally ending its role as a spacecraft and beginning its role as an aircraft. And that's the kind of heat and force and pressure that's exerted there. I would say it's probably equivalent, Shepard, to the throttle up point of an ascent, where they're just making this transition, and of course computers are controlling everything. These crew members were sitting there monitoring their dials, monitoring their instruments, a brand new instrument panel, the glass cockpit, that had just been installed, Shepard, in the Columbia spacecraft. Another thing, Shepard, if I can go there, the families of these crew members, as I understand it, were waiting at Kennedy Space Center at that landing strip, a strip I've stood at many times. And among them, I understand, was Barbara Morgan, the teacher who had been Krista McAuliffe's backup. Barbara Morgan, of course, was scheduled to fly on Columbia in November to become the first astronaut educator, the first teacher in space since the fateful flight of Challenger.
Warren Elliott, Fox Station WTVT in Tampa, an 18-year veteran of covering events at Kennedy Space Center on the East Coast. Warren, it's good of you to join us. Thanks for being with us, and we'd like to check back in with you as we can. First, I want to go to Tony Snow, who's in Washington. Tony, I know that the president is motorcading back. What do you know about details?
Well, just that, Shep. The president's going to be making his way back to the White House. There is no schedule right now for a presidential statement, but one presumes it'll happen. Also, NASA in about, well, let me just take a look at my watch, about 10 minutes, is scheduled to hold a press conference. The frustration for NASA right now, Shep, is the fact that this took place, just as our previous guest pointed out, at a time when the spacecraft is going from the so-called the plasmasphere to the mesosphere. This is according to NASA, and that's the point of highest stress and highest heat. As a consequence, a lot of the things that may provide evidence are probably incinerated. Also, no telemetry at the time. So this is going to be a very painstaking process, and as you pointed out, it took 2 years after the Space Shuttle Challenger accident for the program to get up and running. We have the additional complicating factor right now, which is we got 3 people up in the International Space Station, and obviously we're going to have to find a way to retrieve them. The president also has got to figure out where he wants to go with NASA. There's been a lot of speculation in this administration about thinking big again, going to Mars, doing something that would capture the nation's attention in the way that John F. Kennedy's promised to land on the moon within a decade. He made that promise in 1963, and obviously it was fulfilled in 1969. Something big to capture the imagination and maybe to restore NASA to the kind of storied status it enjoyed in the late 60s and early 1970s when America was placing people on the moon. The administration obviously may have to rethink that as well. This is one of those times where nobody knows what happened. It is going to take a long time to sift through what little evidence is available. And so I don't expect us to get a lot of firm information today other than for NASA to say we're doing everything we can, as you saw, to take a look at pieces of debris and see if there's any piece of evidence that might indicate what happened. The pictures that we saw earlier seem to indicate that something happened very suddenly and obviously, according to NASA, unexpectedly. As a matter of fact, members of the family members had just been ushered into the VIP area down at Cape Canaveral just 5 minutes before the loss of communication. So this is something that caught everybody completely by surprise. And everybody now is trying to do the best they can to make sense of one of these terrible and awful tragedies that occurred about 38 miles over Dallas, Texas.
Tony, would it be your guess that the first voice we hear officially here would be the president's?
Actually, well, the first voice we're going to hear is somebody from NASA. Now, I suspect it'll be some sort of NASA spokesperson. But, you know, this is one of these things. As a former presidential speechwriter, you want the president to say something, but you don't necessarily want him to be there first. You want time to consider exactly what you want to accomplish and the tone you want to set. When Ronald Reagan gave his fabled Challenger speech, it was at the end of the day in 1986, not shortly after the Challenger blew up, just as it was, as you pointed out, throttle up 1 minute 3 seconds into its mission on January 28th, 1986. So I have a feeling that the White House is going to, you know, all the White House speechwriters are probably in right now, and they're trying to figure out exactly what they want to say. They're consulting with NASA. They're consulting with DOD. They're consulting with the president. Expect NASA to get the first shot at this one.
Understood. All right, Tony, keep us updated. Thanks very much. Let's go to Catherine Harridge on Homeland Security now, as the Homeland Security Office weighs in here. Catherine, anything yet?
Yes, Shep. I've been told by officials that Secretary Ridge has been briefed and he has gone to the White House. Officials are emphasizing to me that there is nothing at this time to indicate that terrorism is involved. Now, a couple of things for Homeland Security naturally kick into play in a situation like this. They have a command and coordination center here in Northwest Washington. They are monitoring the situation, but at this time not providing assistance. As for this issue of shoulder-fired missiles, officials tell me this is highly unlikely in this situation, given the shuttle's altitude and its speed. Homeland Security had recently sent up an interagency task force to look at this issue for civilian aircraft, but they're telling me at this point, and this is an important point, the information at this point does not suggest terrorism is involved, Shep.
No suggestion of any kind. Catherine, stay with us if you would. Harvey Kushner is a terrorism expert. Harvey, in the early going, at least, it would appear that terrorism is not on the plate.
That's right, Shep. Obviously, our minds are on this. We had an Israeli involved with this. The magnitude of what we're seeing is just horrible. It's horrific. But quite frankly, from a terrorism perspective, I don't think the groups out there have the technology. As you just heard Catherine say, shoulder-held missile wouldn't be able to reach that altitude nor take out that speed. The other question is, could it have been internal sabotage? You know, one wonders how, with the type of security surrounding the NASA project and this shuttle, could anyone even get close to it to do this type of damage? That would seem highly unlikely. So from the scenario we're witnessing now, it doesn't seem at first blush that this would have anything remotely connected to an act of terrorism. But certainly one thinks about it coming at this age, obviously. When we had the last disaster with the shuttle, no one thought terrorism. But everyone thinks about it, so you got to put it on the plate. And I'm sure Ridge will look. He'll be briefed. He'll discuss it and, look at all the parts. But I think this is just a terrible, terrible, terrible mechanical failure or accident.
It certainly appears in the early going that this is just one tragic accident. I want to update our viewers on a few new items that are coming into us. An Israeli official says we've spoken to the director of NASA, and the Israeli embassy is sending people to Florida to be with the family of the Israeli astronaut. Prime Minister Sharon's hearts are with the American people, the astronaut and his family. We are all waiting and hoping for the best. That from an Israeli official. At just about 8 minutes past 11 o'clock Eastern Time, NASA lowered the flag next to its countdown clock to half-staff, the first unofficial indication of what we really had already known. Harvey Kushner, I'm sure they'll be looking at this from many different angles over the hours and weeks and months and certainly years to come. One of the first things they will try to knock down definitively is terrorism. In a nation where any time something out of the ordinary happens, it's certainly one of the first things to come to your mind.
Oh, absolutely. And they're going to look at this. And conspiracy theorists out there are going to try to make some hay out of this, that somebody got internally inside there. But we're going to have some forensic evidence, unfortunately, that we're going to be able to recover. That's going to tell us a lot what happened there. But Shep, it's very sad that what we're watching, and it's also sad at what happened in 9/11. But now when you put these things together, you have the Israeli on there, and you have, the trouble in the Middle East, and you have all these other situations, and the pending conflict in Iraq, the war, certainly, and what's going on in Afghanistan. It's on everyone's mind. And it's going to play into the fear of terrorism in general, because people won't be convinced that this is not a terrorism act, even though there'll be indications, hopefully, very shortly in the upcoming days and weeks that this was not. But again, this is on everyone's mind, and quite frankly, it's quite disturbing what we're viewing.
Of course it is, and certainly one of their priorities must be to, if in fact this is not terrorism, to be able to knock it down definitively. For instance, the height, the place where it came into the atmosphere, all the rest. Most likely they'll be able to bring together a pretty convincing case in the very early going that it would be a very difficult, if not impossible, thing to do.
Oh, I think absolutely, Shep. I mean, let's compare this, and we really shouldn't, but I think we have to for the viewers out there. TW-800, the altitude and the speed of that made it, possible that a missile could have taken it down. But certainly the speed of reentry of this, as well as the height, and we know the limitations of shoulder-held missiles, would be extraordinarily unlikely. And you got to believe, Shep, that there was assets in the area surrounding the entry of this, which were monitoring this in every which way. So I think you're right. I think that will be quickly ruled out, and then we're going to be taking a look at the failures inside NASA from a technical standpoint to allow such a tragedy to happen.
No doubt. Harvey Kushner, terrorism expert, friend of the program. Harvey, thanks very much. We'd like to get back with you as the day goes on. But here now in Studio B, I have with me the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Dan Gillerman. Sir, it's still impossible to process this, isn't it?
It is. This is a very, first of all, we still pray and hope, as long as there's no final and definite announcement. Our hearts and our prayers are with the American people, with all the families of the astronauts, and with the family of Ilan Ramon, with his wife Rona and his 4 children. This is a terrible, terribly tragic day for all of us.
It's horrible to admit it, but when you wake up on a Saturday morning and you look at the television and you know there's an Israeli astronaut on board for the first time, the reality is that's what goes to your head.
It is terrible, and this is not just an Israeli astronaut. This is a very special person who carries with him much more than just his own personal experience. He carries with him the hopes, the aspirations of Israel at a very difficult time, when this, in a way, brought a ray of hope and light and something positive into a very difficult situation we're in. One must also understand, and this is fate has its ways of bringing home to us messages, that Ilan Ramon is the son of Holocaust survivors. His parents lost all their family in the Holocaust. When he went up in this space shuttle, he took with him a drawing by a 10-year-old boy drawn in the concentration camp of Theresienstadt. That boy eventually perished in Auschwitz. And Ilan Ramon took it up to space as a sign of life prevailing over death, of good prevailing over evil. And I think that the fact that Ilan apparently perished together with 6 Americans is also a manifestation and a testimony to the incredible bond between the US and Israel. A bond of excellence, a bond of hope, a bond of freedom and of bravery. Your national anthem talks about the brave and the free, and I think the people in that shuttle are the embodiment, both the Israeli and the Americans, of everything that's brave, free, and beautiful in this world. And it's such a tragedy that it apparently ended in such a horrible, horrible way.
He certainly was a national hero from all that we read of the papers in Israel. Tell me what you know of his life and his journey to this point.
Well, he was a national hero. He was one of the most decorated pilots in the Israeli Air Force. This has not been confirmed by Israel, but reports claim that he was one of the people who led the raid and the bombing of the nuclear reactor in Iraq in 1981. That raid and bombing were very, very strongly condemned at the time. I think that in retrospect today, when we see what is happening in Iraq, the whole world should be grateful to Israel and for our then Prime Minister Begin, to have carried out this very brave mission. And Ilan Ramon was on that mission. Now, going from that mission on to preparing for this space mission, spending nearly 3 years in this country with his family and 4 children, seeing in it the culmination of everything he's fought for, of everything he's done, making the transition from fighting and bombing and defending his country to going into space and exploring the future for the rest of the world. These were all things which I believe Ilan Ramon believed in very much. He saw this not as a technical mission, but as a life's mission, as something in which he could contribute and Israel could contribute to this tremendous effort of the United States, of the whole free world, to explore new horizons, to bring to all of us, hopefully, a better life. And it is a very personal matter for his parents, who, as I said, are Holocaust survivors, lost all their family, and now losing their son in such tragic circumstances, for his wife, Rona, for his 4 children. But we must remember at this very time also the 6 Americans, each one with their own personal story. And again, as I said, and then we see this all the time, every day, the bond between our 2 countries, the small Israel and the huge United States, both great countries, democratic countries, freedom-loving countries, who by combining together their skills, their technology, their energy, and the bravery of their people in this mission actually manifested to the whole world what this bond and partnership is all about. And it's such a horrible realization to wake up on the Sabbath with these news. And as I said at the beginning, the Sabbath is our day of prayer, and we're still praying, although I know at the moment it looks very bad.
Dan Gillerman is the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations. We want to pause now for a Fox News alert. I'm being told by the producers in charge that we have new video of what happened this morning, and am told that they would like to roll that for you. It was just after 8 o'clock Central Time this morning in the skies over Texas when the shuttle blew up upon re-entering the atmosphere. We're told it happened at about 200,000 feet, was traveling, I believe, at Mach 17, and immediately disintegrated. There has been no official word of what happened to the shuttle, only the lowering of the flags at Kennedy Space Center next to the countdown clock to half-staff. These events, Mr. Ambassador, have become so routine here over the past decade or so. This was not a routine event for our friends in Israel.
No, certainly not. As you said rightly before, Ilan Ramon became a national hero. He became a national hero because he was a very special person going on a very special mission. But beyond that, Israel facing terrorism of the worst and most vicious kind, facing a very harsh reality in a very tough neighborhood we live in. All of a sudden, there's something good happening. There's something you can aspire to, you can identify with. There is someone who is a role model for children, for youth, for everybody in Israel. And everybody around in Israel has rallied around Ilan Ramon and really adopted him as the new face of Israel, as something else we can show the viewers abroad and the viewers on Fox, except for strewn bodies and explosions and terrorists. And it's such a tragedy that this wonderful mission, on its very last, practically on its last minutes, has exploded. So this is, for Israel, both a terrible personal loss, but it is also, in a way, a very cynical way of bringing us back to the very harsh realities we live in. We're all very optimistic. You cannot survive in Israel unless you maintain your optimism and even your sense of humor, but this is no day for humor. It is a day for optimism because these people did go up to do something very special, and I'm sure that the US and NASA will continue. I'm sure that there will be another Israeli astronaut, but the fact that the very first one, being such a special person as well, has found his death in such horrible circumstances will be something which we in Israel will carry with us for many, many, many years. We'll cherish his memory. He is a hero to all of us, as are the other 6 American astronauts. But, you know, I cannot even begin to imagine what the feeling in Israel is like, because the emotions surrounding his departure were just unbelievable. At the time of elections, at the time of terror, out of maybe 40 pages in the paper, 36 were filled with his photos, with his family's photos, with his history. He was on the front page. He was in every television broadcast. And it was to us really a celebration of everything we believe in. And that is what makes today a great day of bereavement.
It does for us all. Dan Gillerman is the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations. Mr. Ambassador, there's new information coming from the White House. Tony Snow has that for us from Washington. Tony?
All right, Shep. Well, what's happening right now is we're beginning to get a little bit of a timeline of what happened today. Sean O'Keefe, the NASA administrator, gave the news to President Bush a little after 10 o'clock today. Actually, he called Andy Card, the White House chief of staff, who then in turn informed the president. Condoleezza Rice is the one who made a call to Vice President Dick Cheney, and we're right now going to try to figure out exactly how that chain worked. In addition, Andy Card informed the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense. Tom Ridge, the Homeland Security Director, is at his post in the White House right now. As we've just seen, this is not merely a national tragedy, but an international tragedy. And as a consequence, a great number of departments and agencies are going to get involved in this. Now, the president has had some conversations, or the White House has had conversations with officials in Israel. The president has not yet spoken with Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. In addition, the search grid now includes the states of Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, perhaps even New Mexico. It's not entirely clear exactly when the explosion occurred. There you see some of the graphic video from earlier today. As you have also pointed out, at 11:08, NASA officially lowered the flag at the Kennedy Space Center to half-mast, thereby indicating that the crew has been lost in the space shuttle. Now, There was talk of a 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time NASA press conference. Obviously, that is being held in abeyance right now. And we're told that there are no plans at present for any on-camera press conferences right away. In addition, we have no scheduled comments from the President of the United States. It's pretty clear right now. It's all hands on deck in Washington. Everybody's scrambling to their offices, trying to figure out exactly what to do and where to go from here. There is now some grisly reporting coming in about the kinds of debris that's falling on the ground in northern Texas. So everybody is literally trying to put the pieces together. And as we've pointed out, this being an international incident obviously involves close contact between the U.S. and Israeli governments. It's it's one of those times now where everybody just prays for not only for those who perished, but the survivors. As you pointed out, Shep, the space shuttle exploded at about 9 a.m. Eastern Time over Texas at about 207,000 feet above the Earth, traveling at a speed of 12,500 miles an hour. It's at a time when the pilot of the shuttle engages in a series of banking maneuvers, going back and forth 4 times, actually, as it crosses the United States, trying to slow the shuttle as it gets ready to lower its speed from the initial entry into our atmosphere at 17,500 miles an hour to about a 215 mile per hour landing. It was scheduled at the Kennedy Space Center at 9:16. Ironically or tragically, the family members had been ushered into VIP quarters only 5 minutes before the loss of contact. As you have had on the air a number of times already, Shep, there are a series of speculations about what might have caused this, nobody having any clue. There were reports of insulation coming off an external fuel tank when the shuttle first lifted off. NASA engineers looked at that. They didn't think it was going to be a problem. There's also talk of buildup of temperatures. This explosion occurred at the hottest and most stressful moment of re-entry. And the zipper effect, as you have discussed also, is one of these things where a small tear can literally rip through an entire craft. That may be what happened. We don't really know at this point. We're trying to get details. President Bush is motorcading back to the White House as we speak. It's a fairly long journey from Camp David, certainly by ground, to the White House, but it's overcast and not safe today here in Washington for a helicopter delivery of the president. The one suspects that he is going to be meeting with key advisors. Condoleezza Rice, we know, is on board. The vice president, I think, has been in Texas. We're trying to track that down for the weekend. Everybody's going to come back to Washington, and we will bring you the very latest as we figure out what the president and all his key advisors are going to be doing here in town in response to what happened today. In addition, we'll try to get you a schedule for when there are, if there are going to be, any public statements by anybody in the Bush administration. Shep?
Tony, you mentioned these reports coming out of Texas, and so many of them are coming to us from the town of Nacogdoches, which is 135 miles north and east of Houston. Business after business owner, resident after resident, reporting seeing debris literally all over the town. And to quote a barber, the space shuttle is everywhere. The President of the United States, who has been through enormous tragedy with this nation already, will have a very big task ahead of him. As a speechwriter, how do you prepare a man for an event like that?
You know, I think what you have to do, Shep, when you write a speech like this is you have to let somebody speak from the heart. George W. Bush is a man of great determination, great faith, but he's also somebody who cares deeply about other people. Now, his political opponents may disagree, but when you see the president talking about people in the services, he tears up. Yesterday, there was an event when the president was talking about AIDS victims, and you can see he was getting emotional then. This is a man who feels the pangs of human tragedy very deeply. He has not led, he's lived hard. He's been through a lot. And as a consequence, I think he has a keener sensitivity to these kinds of things. So if I were writing a speech for George W. Bush, I would make it as plain spoken as possible. This is not a guy you want to have reading Shakespeare. It's not him. But on the other hand, he's somebody who really does, I think, have a very good sense of how to minister to people in a time like this, and in a funny way, that's what a president has to do. Ronald Reagan, as I pointed out, on the day of the Challenger accident in 1986, on January 28th, toward the end of the day, gave a beautiful, lyrical, typical Reagan-esque speech where he not only expressed his, passed on his sentiments to the families of those involved, but also tried to lock into the larger fact that Americans have a romantic sense about the space program. It goes back to the Kennedy years when John Kennedy, barely a month before his assassination, said that it was his ambition before that decade was out to send a man to the moon and return him safely to Earth. And lo and behold, it happened in July of 1969 when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin set foot on the moon. Americans have always looked at the space program as something special, a way in which we escape the bonds of the Earth and begin to capture not only a sense of an imagination of the vastness of space, but also the ingenuity of the United States. When events like this happen, we are confronted with the enormous difficulties that we face in trying to do that exploration, and also the enormous dangers involved. There have been times, we saw it when Krista McAuliffe was included on the Space Shuttle Challenger, when people are led to believe that, you know, this is kind of like a tourist trip. Dennis Tito going on a Russian craft, it seems like a lark. Well, it is not. It is enormously complicated. Now we have the oldest craft in the fleet exploding upon re-entry. My guess is there are going to be vigorous hearings on Capitol Hill later on as people try to talk about what happened. But for today, the most important thing the president can do is express a sense of sorrow, a sense of admiration, and again, a sense of awe for the universe in which we live in our attempts at various times to tame it or even to explore it. Shep?
Tony Snow in Washington. Tony, thanks very much. I want to go now to John Pike, who is a global securities expert and is here now with a screenwriter sort of display of exactly what it's believed that now happened. John, what are you able to tell us?
Well, unfortunately, we're not able to tell nearly as much publicly as NASA is going to be able to figure out over the next several hours, because there's some very key questions that NASA needs to be able to answer in terms of exactly what was going on the shuttle orbiter at the moment it disintegrated. There are a lot of activities in terms of the auxiliary power units operating, in terms of the elevons on the shuttle maneuvering. They're going to need to look very closely at where the shuttle was in the timeline to try to understand what it was that happened at the specific moment that the orbiter broke up that could have initiated a chain of events to cause it to disintegrate. And if we look at some enlargements of some of the video that we've seen on the screenwriter, if we could go to that first slide on the screenwriter, we can see that the orbiter has indeed broken up. Here's one large piece, another large piece, an additional large piece here. NASA is going to be looking very closely at the camera video to try to understand what the sequence of the breakup was, to try to understand how the orbiter fell apart, because as we can see in this next enlargement, that there was one large piece, probably a significant component of the fuselage, and then we have an enormous number of these smaller pieces that have come off of the orbiter, reconstructing the sequence of events in which the orbiter disintegrated, trying to figure out how it came apart, might help them understand, was there an explosion of an auxiliary power unit? Was there something, the so-called zipper effect, where possibly a large strip of the thermal tiles was stripped off? Was there some other mechanical failure that could have led the orbiter to break up in that particular way? So hopefully, by looking at the sequence of events after the orbiter broke up, looking at where the orbiter was in the programmed, planned reentry sequence, they're going to have at least some lines of inquiry, some good theories as to what might have gone wrong here. Hopefully they're going to start to get some answers to those questions fairly quickly. Now the problem, of course, is that there are much larger answers and questions involved here. What's going to happen to the International Space Station? Are we going to continue to fly the space shuttle, or are we going to get a replacement for it? What are we going to do with the existing fleet? How long is the shuttle going to be grounded? How quickly could they get it back in space? Some of those very much larger policy questions are going to have to be addressed in the weeks ahead. I think that the first question that they're trying to answer today, though, is what was going on the orbiter at the moment that it disintegrated, and what could have led to this tragic event.
How much information do they get from instruments on the ground, John, throughout the process here?
Well, one of the key questions that I think NASA is going to be having to answer today is exactly what sort of telemetry were they getting off of the shuttle. Now, of course, when the shuttle begins re-entry, they're getting a lot of telemetry off of the orbiter through communication satellites. It goes through a blackout period, however, when the heat of re-entry basically cuts off a lot of the communications. Once it slows down, gets lower, the communications are restored. And so the question is exactly how much telemetry were they getting off the shuttle at the point that it broke up? NASA obviously knows the answer to that question. That probably should be the first question put to them at their news conference this morning.
How much more time would it have been before humans took over the operation of that vehicle?
Well, the thing that's marvelous, has always been marvelous to me about the space shuttle, is that the thing is so incredibly complex that they're pretty much flying on automatic pilot most of the time. There's simply too much going on for a human being to actively manage. There's always the option for the pilots to intervene, to be piloting the shuttle, but flying at those speeds, at those altitudes with such a complex machine, frankly, I'd put my trust in the computers before I'd put the trust in the pilot, and that's basically the way it's normally flying.
They would have landed how long later? A couple of hours, right?
No, they were only about 10 minutes out of landing at that very long runway at the Kennedy Space Center. So they were about a third of the way through the reentry. They had been orbiting at a speed of about 17,000 miles an hour. They had gotten down to 12,000 miles an hour and obviously want to get to 200 miles an hour when they hit the runway.
It's always... Excuse me, John, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, it seems as if, especially after Challenger, from working in the Kennedy Space Center market for so long, it seemed as if they tested every single possibility 1,000,000 times.
Well, they certainly were very conscious of the responsibility that they bore before every launch, and I think that everybody involved in the space program, working in the program, an outside observer like me, understands that NASA is basically betting the space program every time they launch the shuttle. At the same time, though, with the budget cutbacks that NASA experienced with the end of the space race with the Soviet Union a decade ago, there was a lot of concern that they were laying off experienced people, that they didn't have enough money to do the sort of safety and quality assurance inspections that were needed. And frankly, I think that NASA was overly optimistic about how reliable the shuttle was, and maybe they felt that spaceflight had become routine and that it would be possible for them to cut back on some of these safety inspections without risking the sort of catastrophe we saw today. That is obviously going to be a question that investigators are going to have to look at. The question of whether it was simply a mechanical failure or whether it was also an institutional failure, as we saw in the case of the Challenger accident. There was the mechanical failure with the solid rocket motor O-rings, but there were also institutional failures in terms of the way NASA was interfacing with the contractors, and they were obviously under a lot of budget pressure then, and NASA has certainly been under a tremendous amount of budget pressure over the last couple of years because of those big cost overruns with the space station. So these are all questions that I think the Congress, probably an independent commission, as we saw after the Challenger accident, these are all questions that are going to need to be asked and answered before we can move ahead with the space program.
John, Tony mentioned this number 100, every 100 launches, and the talk had been for more than a decade about how every 100 launches the odds get bad, yet no one ever really seemed to pay much attention to that. Was that some sort of magic number that came from somewhere? You know what I'm saying?
Well, frankly, I feel like I've been a voice crying in the wilderness on this for the last decade, because before
I've certainly heard you cry about it, but I've heard very few take note.
Well, the problem is that, let's review what the numbers were. Before the Challenger accident, NASA said that the odds of a catastrophic failure were 1 in 100,000, which was obviously a made-up number. After the Challenger accident, they went back and redid their estimates, and they said that the odds were 1 in 86. Well, over the last 15 years since the Challenger accident, their calculation of the odds of a catastrophic failure have grown to something like 1 in 500, which would basically mean, by their calculation, there's not going to be another accident before the whole fleet wears out in the middle of the century. And when you go to look at where these risk numbers come from, frankly, they're pretty close to simply being made up. I think that NASA was basically just guessing what the reliability of the shuttle was.
John, excuse me for just a minute, and I hate to interrupt you for this because this is something we already know. But for the first time now, there is official word, now 53 minutes past 11 a.m. on the East Coast, and a senior U.S. official is quoted as saying that the shuttle is gone. That would be the first official word from any U.S. official, and there you have it.
That's confirming what I think we've been seeing with our own eyes for some time now.
Of course it is, and I want to find out, John, stay with us for a minute. I'd like to try to find out who gave this word. James Rosen, our White House correspondent, is standing by there now. James, what do you know?
Well, Shepard, we are expecting the arrival of President Bush back here at the White House any moment now. The crews are gathering on the south lawn of the White House for his motorcade. President Bush spoke earlier today with Sean O'Keefe, the director of NASA, at around 10:30 this morning. The president having been informed very shortly after the incident about its occurrence by Andrew Card, his chief of staff, of course the same individual who informed President Bush back on September the 11th of that incident. We also know that Tom Ridge, the Homeland Security Secretary, is here at the White House. He has been in touch with officials in 5 southern and southwestern states, talking to state officials about the handling of debris and related matters. Those states including Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Arizona, and New Mexico. We also know that the National Security Advisor, Dr. Condoleezza Rice, is on hand here at the White House. We expect that the president will be putting in a call to the Israeli Prime Minister, Ariel Sharon, to express America's condolences over the loss of the first Israeli astronaut, of course, who was on board the shuttle. As well, we expect that the president may make some kind of statement to the American people. No details about that have been released yet, but we did see activity in which some White House employees were moving the presidential podium from the Eisenhower Executive Office building over to the West Wing area of the White House. That might suggest that a statement is imminent from President Bush upon his arrival here at the White House just a few minutes from now. And finally, Shepard, we expect that the president will also be consulting with officials at the Pentagon and elsewhere to determine what exactly caused this crash. We do know that one senior White House official tells us it is not believed to be terrorism related, and also a CIA official confirms to Fox News the same, that there is no belief that this is terrorism related. So at this moment, Shepard, we are awaiting President Bush's arrival here at the White House imminently. Shepard, back to you.
James, we are getting breaking news on another subject, James, and I don't know how much information you have about this, but as we watch this national tragedy and beyond, we're getting word from Tariq Aziz that Inspector Blix is to visit Baghdad on February the 8th. This, as of last night's Fox report, they had made a decision to defer a decision on something like that, waiting, we presumed at the time, to find out what it was that Saddam Hussein wanted to talk about. Do you have any knowledge of this?
Well, I know that the invitation had been extended by the Iraqis. The news that you just related, Shepard, is news to me, too, that apparently the UNMOVIC teams have apparently agreed to visit Iraq as per the invitation of Saddam Hussein. This is, as the White House has been calling it, the final phase where the diplomatic window with Iraq remains open for a period that the White House has characterized as weeks, not months. But what you just related was news to me as well, Shepard.
All right. James Rosen at the White House. James, get what you can. We'll get back to you. In the meantime, I can tell you that Governor Huckabee of the state of Arkansas is now reporting that he believes at least that there is shuttle debris that has rained on his state as well in 3 counties. And they are asking us to remind you that if in fact you are in Arkansas or Texas and you see something that's believed to be part of the space shuttle, not to get near it and to call authorities. Tony Snow in Washington for us. Tony?
Well, Shep, just a couple of other things. It now appears that officials are leaning toward believing that the explosion occurred before it got to northern Texas. That is based on maybe the debris field, and that is why the search effort begins in the state of New Mexico and now obviously is extending all the way to Arkansas. I was talking with an administration official just a moment ago who tried to explain some of the hazards involved in this kind of a flight. He said, look, you've got 1960s technology, even though this particular space shuttle had been updated. And it's like he said, a 100-ton brick traveling at 25,000 feet per second, 5 miles per second. The other thing is that the space shuttle is oddly vulnerable. It's a peculiar thing. If a tile comes off, the skin underneath it is about the width of a cookie sheet. You can push in on it and the thing will give. So if there is any damage to a series of tiles, and this is one of the points of speculation because some insulation apparently came off during the liftoff and hit one of the wings. If any of the insulation comes off, you can have portions underneath it subjected to extreme heat, which it cannot withstand, and that creates the zipper effect that has been discussed a number of times on the air. Ironically, the most damage before this ever inflicted on a shuttle was during a rainstorm. You may recall, Shep, they were flying one of the shuttles on a 747 from California back to the Kennedy Space Center, got hit in a hailstorm and was heavily damaged. So as you can see, even though these are wondrous, incredibly complicated machines, as a matter of fact, the engines themselves have 70,000 working parts. During the phases that we're seeing here, and typically during re-entry, the pilots are pretty much passengers because the autopilot takes over. They try to make this as precise as possible, but obviously something went hideously wrong today. Shep?
No doubt. Tony Snow live for us in Washington. Tony, thanks very much. It's noon in the east, 9 o'clock in the west. Let's reset for viewers who are just joining us. I'm Shepard Smith in New York. This is Fox News continuing coverage of what is now confirmed to be the loss of Space Shuttle Columbia. It happened 8 o'clock Central Time in the skies over Texas. We now have reports that Shuttle Columbia has rained down over New Mexico, Texas, and parts of Arkansas, that all 7 souls on board have been lost. The President of the United States is heading back to the White House. He's been notified, but because of weather in the area, he's motorcading from Camp David to the White House. The families of those who were on board the space shuttle had been taken to KSC. It would have landed just 15 minutes later. Confirmation has come from a senior U.S. official who has asked not to be identified that, quote, Columbia is gone and all on board are lost. Those who were on board, the commander of this particular flight, Rick Husband, 45 years old, an Air Force colonel from Amarillo, Texas. The former test pilot was selected as an astronaut in '94 on his 4th try. He made up his mind as a child that it was what he was going to do with his life. Quoting here, "It's been pretty much a lifelong dream and just a thrill to be able to get to actually live it out." That in an interview before Columbia's launch, his 2nd space flight. The pilot on board this flight, William McCool, 41, Navy commander from Lubbock, Texas, and father of 3 sons. He graduated 2nd in his 1983 class at the Naval Academy, went on to test pilot school, became an astronaut in '96. This was his first space flight. The payload commander here, Michael Anderson, 43, the son of an Air Force man who grew up on military bases. He was flying for the Air Force when NASA chose him in '94 as one of only a handful of black astronauts. He traveled to Russia's Mir space station back in '98. The lieutenant colonel was in charge of Columbia's dozens of science experiments. His home was in Spokane, Washington. Also on board this flight, Kalpana Chawla, 41, who immigrated to the United States from India in the 1980s and became an astronaut in 1994. On only other space flight in 1997, she made mistakes that sent science satellite tumbling out of control.